it may, let me turn to the colonial episteme itself, where the key idea of the social that I've already discussed came to be variously supplemented and contradicted by notions of quote-unquote culture and tradition. These meanings were further developed in contrast to notions of the political. Simultaneously paired and contrasted, terms such as the social and the political, or quote-unquote Indian society and the British state, were in turn upheld and carried forward by colonial knowledges such as sociology, anthropology, theories of religion and philosophy, as well as political theories such as liberalism, and we heard a great deal about this morning. There is little question that from the first debates over the abolition of sati or widow immolation that inaugurated social reform to the rise of women's organizations in late colonial India a century later, these are the terms through which women's case was sought to be fought and overcome. According to several formulations, women's status became tied up with questions of culture, variously rendered as tradition or religion, in the 30-year debate over sati, for instance, or even as Brahmanism by Jyotirao Phule or Dharabai Shinde. By the end of that century, and not only in the regions of colonial Bengal or Western India, social reform agendas were being increasingly taken over and recast by the rising politics of nationalism. According to Partha Chatterjee's much cited and contested formulation, nationalist discourses were able to successfully resolve the women's question precisely because nationalism was a cultural discourse before it was a political one. Women then became the bearers of Indian culture and tradition, but a recast, indeed modernized tradition. It should no longer surprise us then that by the turn of the 20th century, the most conflicted terms of the women's question for the first generation of pre-independence feminists were indeed culture and modernity. The new woman for the nation in the making could not be modern like the Western woman, or without culture like the quote-unquote lower class or lower caste woman. She had to be schooled, indeed educated in the right kind of tradition for the future. The spheres of the home, of conjugal relations, of religious practice and domesticity, these were the critical spheres of sovereignty for the colonized, since the colonial state had conquered the material, public, economic spheres. Arguing on similar terrain, but from a different vantage point, Kanika Sarkar has argued that the very sphere of the home within revivalist nationalist discourses was a deeply Hindu patriarchal construct, saturated by discourses of tradition as scripture, but with infant marriage as its ideal. By the end of the century, public debates over conjugal violence and the age of consent, penetrating the innermost structures of the Hindu family, were not just the preserve of Hindu nationalism, but also, in her view, became the basis for an undoubtedly as yet fragile notion of rights, thus marking rudimentary and inchoate links between a social issue and a political one, society and the state. The subject of women thus came to occupy a place of tension between the social and political realms, with culture as a kind of limit or stopping point. These alignments came to a head around the close of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, during the very years that saw the development of the first women's organizations and the growing force of nationalism. Given the special relationship between women and culture in curtailing the energies of social reform, with Hindu nationalism re-signifying Indian womanhood as the bearer of tradition in the battle against colonialism and the West, it may be somewhat clearer to us now why feminism, whether named as such from the early 20th century, or simply as a shorthand for the battles conducted in the name of women, came to occupy such a conflicted position. With feminism on the side of modernity and the normative woman, middle class, Hindu, upper caste, deeply familial on the side of culture, we can now see how the national response to colonialism in India set in motion a set of objections to feminism in particular as alien and in conflict with Indian culture. So I'm saying that one of the founding frames for thinking about the women's question in India is indeed this framing of feminism and being in conflict with something called Indian culture. And yet there was nothing hard and fast about this set of tensions. As the historian Mrinalini Sinha has demonstrated during the interwar years of the 1920s and 30s, changing historical circumstances and imperial realignments made possible a brief coming together of the social and political in the wake of the controversy over Catherine Mayo's Mother India. Turning the arguments about the backwardness of Hindu society and especially its religious sanctions of practices such as child marriages on their heads, by claiming instead that such backwardness should be laid at the door of colonial policies, this generation of women leaders even demanded, and this is one of the calls they gave out in the 1920s and 30s, they said, if indeed this goes against Hindu tradition, then we want new shastras. This was one of the things that these feminists listed. New religious scriptures, which in order to raise the age of marriage, if such a practice were to go against what sacred texts have to say. Women's organizations thus produced a new universal subject, heralding the arrival of liberalism and universal rights through women, cutting across religious communities and castes in their battle to raise the age of marriage of all Indian women from 12 to 14 years. So in this battle over what counts as culture, what counts as religion, what counts as a sacred text, we see women occupying a kind of universal liberal subject position that indeed was not being occupied by any other group at this time. Contextualizing these claims might benefit through a comparison of the Indian 19th century with its European counterpart. Clearly, social reform was hardly confined to the colonies. According to Denise Riley, it is precisely an unprecedented conception of the social in early 19th century Britain, a new topography, she calls it, which did not have a conscious past, becoming a groundswell in the Western world that was able to imbue pre-modern understandings of women and her nature with a new content. And as she puts it, the social does not really admit women into it. It is as if women become established as a new kind of sociological collectivity. And this is 19th century Britain. Riley is more concerned to show how this new construction enables what was not possible before, namely a disengagement from women, of women as embodiments of nature. However, what she fails to appreciate, and this is my argument, is that such undoubtedly new notions of women as social did not go uncontested, but went hand in hand with equally powerful discourses of biology, medicine, psychology, and psychiatry, among others, which sought to realign woman with biology and so with nature, with fundamental consequences for the future of feminism in Europe and the Western world more broadly. Bourgeois womanhood was produced as much through the elaborate apparatus that gave the world women's physical frailty, diminished brain size, and the Freudian anatomy as destiny, all of which fed into her incapacity for any political role as citizen. The discourses of biology and nature in relation to questions of the social in Western contexts have, in my view, been as profound as those of the cultural and social in Indian contexts, that is colonial India, and as long-lasting. It is not for nothing that what is most remembered in Simone de Beauvoir's vast text, The Second Sex, is her slogan, "One is not born but becomes a woman," a statement meant precisely to counter the massive institutional and discursive deployment whereby the biological facticity of femaleness was uniquely woman's burden. The extraordinary history of feminist engagements with the problematic of woman, nature, and culture, and the even more fascinating twists and turns in the English-speaking world around the sex-gender distinction show few signs of abating. Biology has thus been central to the founding episteme of Western feminism, whose universalizing claims have yet to be placed in the right perspective. I would contend that this has been somewhat different in situations like India, where biology fed into much more powerful dominant discourses on culture, tradition, and their relation to concepts of the social. So much so that it is binaries such as tradition modernity or social political that have been formative, creating a sense of conflict between culture and politics and an ambivalence towards modernity. For some, modernity was coterminous with emancipation and women's rights, while culture and feminism could not be readily aligned and have been frequently pitted against each other right up to the present. A contemporary example, replete with its own ironies, would be the ongoing struggle over the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, that is Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. As you all know, I'm sure, this section was instituted by the British in 1860 to criminalize certain sexual acts as being against the order of nature. This is the text, in other words, in the 1860s. It is surely all the more instructive that in current battles over repealing IPC 377, opposing voices have insisted precisely that homosexuality in India cannot be condoned since it is against Indian culture. So this is, I'm trying to say how these very different terms resonate in our respective contexts. Be that as it may, by the 1930s and certainly by the 40s, the prominent strands of social, for example, political nationalism sidelined women's issues, but on the other hand, communist and socialist-inspired women and men reached out to working women and to a lesser extent to rural women and made economic rights central for the first time. So let me now move quickly to the next episteme that I have called the national episteme. one which was by no means unique to India but was in all likelihood shared widely by many decolonizing nations of the erstwhile Third World. The national episteme was a response to the resolution of the nationalist movement through the creation of the Indian nation state and the provision of universal citizenship to all its people, hitherto subjected to the governmentalities of aerial rule. After almost 2 centuries of colonialism, including the violent experience of partition and the creation of Pakistan, the Indian nation needed to imagine itself anew. It must be recalled here just what kind of unprecedented situation India was in, historically speaking. From the perspective of a relatively weak capitalist class, this meant facing a challenge which no capitalist class in the world has ever successfully tackled, that is to say, to make an industrial revolution under capitalism within a political structure of electoral democracy and universal adult suffrage. This, I believe, in order to take this forward, in order to have this break from a colonial moment to the national moment, this required the worldview of development. Focusing on specific issues and events in post-colonial India after independence, Rajeshwari Sundararajan has rightly placed her emphasis on a matrix of critical terms for women and the women's movement in relation to the state, citizenship and the law, all of which are political concepts. My sense, however, is that this matrix is critically incomplete without the notion of development. Development offered a view of the future and a break from the colonial past in post-colonial conditions which were rife with innumerable signs of continuity. This conception of the nation, and in other words, what I'm trying to say is that with development, the Indian version of this ideology brought together state, nation and economy in a potent combination. Economic nationalism, not cultural nationalism, was now the central organizing principle. Tradition was to be contained through modernization, and formal equality to all was enshrined within a new constitution. Pre-independence women's movements effectively handed over the task of nation building and the progress of India's women to the state. Other voices were marginalized. This conception was to remain more or less in place for the first 2 decades of the 1950s and 60s. But by the end of the 60s and certainly in the early years of the 70s, this model of nation-state development suffered its first cracks and came to crisis with the imposition of a state of political emergency 1975-77 under the premiership of Indira Gandhi. Women's studies and a newly forged women's movement were born in this moment or soon after this moment of political and economic turmoil and unrest. In my view, women's studies and a fresh phase of the women's movement produced this national episteme in the form of an internal critique of state-led economic development and liberal equality. By this I mean that the critiques of the 1970s called the state to account precisely for its perceived dilution, if not outright reneging of its founding mandate. It was to the nation state that the first activists and scholars of this generation addressed their anger and shock at the signs of widespread failure and from whom they demanded the full rights of citizenship. This critique was made up of 2 broad strands. There were the critiques of development and poverty, with existing evidence pointing to a worsening of the situation of women in the very years devoted to state-led planning and progress. And secondly, there were the critiques of the law and of society from the perspective of violence against women, including by representatives of the state, such as the police. In order to demonstrate the relative novelty of the ingredients of the national episteme for Indian feminism, let me take the example of poverty. After all, the poverty of India was hardly a new question and had exercised the minds and energies of nationalists from the late 19th century in their attacks on the British and their impoverishment of India. A powerful imaginary of India as an enslaved economy animated movements such as the Swadeshi movement, the Drain theory of colonialism, and so on. But as I've argued above, this was not how women were being articulated, given the modes in which the social and cultural became the primary horizons of meaning and contestation. It is only with the arrival of development discourse and practice, that is, it's only after the 1950s and 60s, that hitherto marginal battles over women as workers, and not just wives and mothers, and the vast spaces of rural India could come into the foreground. To take the example of an early essay reviewing the birth of women's studies in India in the 1970s, Veena Mazumdar and Kumun Sharma look back at the history of social reform, the political mobilizations of the national movement, and the establishment of constitutional guarantees of equality to question the large-scale neglect of women's issues by the social sciences in the years following independence. They were at their sharpest in criticizing ongoing scholarship that placed the onus of women's low status on the ongoing force of tradition and culture. Instead, they drew attention to and called for more work on women's participation in agriculture, the urban informal sector, women's declining political representation, the effects of contemporary socialization processes, the overall trends of modernization, in their words, the magnitude and complexity of women and development. So this, in my view, is the second major, that is the national episteme, within which then the women's question finds re-articulation. Therefore, whereas the colonial episteme had been primarily organized around the social, in relationships of contestation to concepts of tradition and culture, the national episteme was constituted through a critique of modernity and development, a modernity whose claims to equality had rendered women's marginalization invisible. Laws concerning violence were critiqued precisely for their colonial origins, for being a century out of date in a modern nation. The development process was questioned for its exclusions, especially of poor women, and modern middle-class society was attacked for encouraging such phenomena as the murder of young brides by their in-laws. So it's during this period that the social then undergoes a kind of contraction, a very energizing notion of century earlier. Nothing could be more depoliticizing for the 1970s generation of feminists to be told that a problem or an issue is a social evil. A social evil was for us at that time the most negative kind of description that could be given to a problem. And this was very much visible when we had when there was a Shah Banu case, as well as when the new case of Sati hit in 1987 in Rajasthan. But by the close of the 1980s and certainly by the 1990s, feminists were to discover the ground moving beneath their feet again, forcing them onto unfamiliar terrain. A series of critical events have been disorienting and disturbing feminist perspectives, events from within the nation and beyond. Globalization is the most familiar term that has been used to designate the shift in paradigm in countries like India, from the thinking and planning led by economic nationalism towards the belief in greater global integration through less restrictive markets, a restructured role of the state, and so on. However, for reasons that I hope will become clearer as I go along, I wish to describe the new episteme that took shape from the 1990s with the designation post-national. By post-national, I mean a situation where the nation is no longer the obvious or only horizon or frame of reference for our questions and critiques. As a collective statement introducing the post-national condition praised it, and I'm quoting, the post-national signals an intellectual condition, a position of critique, and a new horizon of intelligibility beyond that constituted by the nation-state in its heyday. This does not necessarily mean that the era of the nation-state is over, but it does mean that the emancipatory potential once embodied in the nation-state is not at all that evident. There is nothing accidental in the negativity emanating from this description of an episteme meant to provide some kind of orientation for our present questions and critiques. After all, it is a series of negative events in the early 1990s, from the claims to dislodge development agendas through liberalization and globalization, the rise of the Hindu right wing with new claims to hegemony, to the mode in which questions of caste broke into a largely quote-unquote casteless political ethos. All of these have been critical. The unfolding of this complex of events has meant that both the significance of the internal composition of the nation and its people, questions that the national episteme and its development and the development it promised was supposed to have solved, and that of our relationship to the worlds beyond our borders, have fundamentally altered the frames within which questions of feminism and women's rights are functioning today. The conception of the post-national being deployed here, therefore, should not be confused with the sense in which corporations and self-defined global civil society conceive of spaces above and beyond the nation. The dislodging of the nation as the horizon which had been forged in the wake of colonialism is therefore not simply being supplanted by a new global or cosmopolitan episteme as dominant Western discourses would have us believe. If anything, fractures within the nation have made their presence felt even before the growing onslaught of globalization and neoliberal policies could have their effects. Assumptions such as the desire for a uniform civil code in matters relating to the sphere of personal laws were fundamentally recast, one of which was to jettison the very idea that such a code was essential for national integration. Dalit feminists, naming caste exclusions within the women's movement, established national level organizations of their own, sometimes in relation to international events such as the Beijing Conference of 1995. This is also why the term post-national is meant to resist the over-easy narrative of a shift from the national phase of India's post-independence history and epistemic self-understanding to a globalizing one. One of the problems with the hegemony thus accorded to globalization is that it crowds out alternate context-sensitive accounts of our present. This is not to deny the significance of the very nature and force of neoliberal globalization in comparison to the development era that it seeks to supplant. What strikes me as particularly relevant here, given my interest in ideas and terms, is that the arrival of globalization as a new frame of economic policy became the occasion for a crystallization of differences within the women's movement. The era of development could act as a kind of umbrella for Gandhian, left-wing, Nehruvian, eco-feminist, and many other orientations that emerged during the 1970s and 80s. The severe disorientation unleashed by the revival of right-wing economic agendas since the 1990s has made us more rather than less aware of our own diversities by way of a response. And this diversity towards globalization exists in spite of the fact that these are positions and arguments held by feminists committed to social justice who are seasoned members of the women's movement. Furthermore, as I've also emphasized, any grid for understanding the present must make room for the re-emergence of communalism, the rise of caste, and more recently of non-normative sexualities. Each of these has disturbed the ground of the women's movement in fundamental ways and needs to be looked at in their own right, whatever their ramifications with global processes. There is no way, for instance, that the wave of backward caste politics of the 1980s, culminating in the violent backlash of upper caste campaigns opposing caste-based quotas in 1990, popularly called the anti-Mandal agitations, can be laid at the door of globalization. If anything, links would have to be drawn in the opposite direction, as upper caste elites kicked away the welfare state as the ladder they no longer needed, with greater ferocity after the move to implement reservations in government services and higher education. Interestingly, it was also only in the 1990s that mainstream feminists developed caste-based critiques of gender, rediscovered the forgotten legacies of anti-caste leaders from the colonial period, such as Jyotiba Phule, Periyar, and Babasaheb Ambedkar. And to this day, Dalit feminists are not just raising demands for a separate political space, but pointing to an ongoing blindness in mainstream approaches to caste. Issues of sexuality have been equally far-reaching and contentious. Indeed, it was initially possible for many women's activists and organizations to try and evade the newer languages and challenges of sexuality movements, such as the gay and lesbian movement or struggles over sex work, precisely by seeing them as offshoots of globalization. Thus, heavily financed AIDS awareness campaigns among sex workers have been targeted or viewed with considerable unease, as have been non-government organizations and collectives mobilizing on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues. At the same time, and to my mind, this is what makes our current movement so genuinely challenging, new debates and differences have also emerged, as in the case of the ban on the bar dancers in Mumbai several years ago. It is no longer the question of westernization that troubles us as feminists in thinking about the politics of sexuality, but rather perhaps troubled connections with caste oppression that demand ongoing dialogue. This account of the crisscrossing issues and concerns that are gathering force in a mode that I believe is best described as post-national will be incomplete without acknowledging the achievements and problems besetting feminism itself. And I think today we all know, this is again very recent, since the 1990s, that feminism now has found its way into our classrooms. We have women's studies centers, for instance, the center here. There are 150 such centers across the country. Gender is a term that is now being used a great deal by NGOs and the state in a range of ways. Therefore, there's a kind of new visibility that attaches to women. Along with this greater institutional visibility of feminism today, there are accounts and acknowledgements of the complex experiences of a younger generation, some of them metropolitan students, that at times also appears to be disavowing feminism. A teacher in a Mumbai college described this about a decade ago, described her disappointment when, barring a few exceptions, most women students that she was teaching, and she was teaching a women's studies course for the first time, did not relate positively to issues concerning the women's movement and feminist theorizing. For some, English-speaking, upwardly mobile, and with strong professional ambitions of their own, feminism was rejected because it seemed to block or mock their desires. For others, especially lower middle class students unsure of any future outside of theorizing and the media, are in the last analysis closing down feminism. And this is very much an analysis that is coming out of out of Britain in the 1980s and 90s. In other words, there's a closing down of feminism, if in ingenious ways which cannot be pinned down to an open backlash. I would rather say that post-feminist articulations in our context coexist with a range of other signs that indicate the politically constructive modes in which we live in a time after feminism. Through the problematization of the subject of feminism, through the invitation that this could be the best time to see like a feminist, and this is Nivedita Menon's best-selling book, so simultaneously as you have people saying, no, I'm not a feminist, you have best-selling books of this nature, and through the very attacks of Dalit feminists, we turn feminism into what it must become if it is to live on, namely contested terrain. So what I'm trying to I want to conclude here, I'm trying to sort of present you with a set of interpretation, a set of frames within which perhaps we can think about how the women's question, how feminism finds its way of living on under very, very different contexts. It began its life as fully and thoroughly colonial. It then re-emerges in the 70s in a national frame, and I believe it today lives on in a post-national one. So I'll be happy for any discussions and questions. Thank you.
Open for discussion now.
Extending where you ended.
Yes.
So we talked about how you have post-feminist sort of movement where you look at feminism as being done with it.
I think you won't be heard by anyone else except maybe me. So why don't you just shift?
I just wanted you to comment on something. So
yes.
You talk about how post-feminism is currently the move where you consider feminism to be over, right?
I don't think feminism is over.
No, not do I.
Not at all.
No, but that's, a lot of people do that and
yes.
they say,
yes.
Why do I not need feminism? And that's a big thing on the internet. And my question is particularly regarding to this. So in pop culture, feminism is now a thing. So you have popular musicians, popular authors, and popular filmmakers claiming feminism as their own. But then there is also criticism of the very same thing, saying it's a capitalist agenda to make feminism a product. So I just wanted you to take it a step ahead to the current moment, where what it means to be a feminist, say within this this sphere of, you have people like Chimamanda who write on or who talk and write on what feminism is, but then you have people like musicians who take that and then they make it into a product. So that is particularly interesting because to a young person who considers themselves feminist, Chimamanda is one sort of a power, but then someone like Beyonce who sings about it and makes it popular is another sort of power. And the criticism which comes out, if you could
say something.
Yeah, say something about that.
Shall I take a group of questions and then respond all in one group?
I just want to add to that question.
I can't hear you.
Can I be a bit louder? Probably ask if because I'm actually doing my PhD in a topic which is basically I want to look at online harassment against women, and I came across some papers wherein they suggested that this whole thing of post-feminist is almost like a ploy by capitalism and neoliberal mechanisms to put forward the idea that feminism is no longer required and that we have actually attained, so it's almost like a ploy by neoliberal mechanisms to sort of put forward the idea that feminism is no longer needed and we've fought the battle and we have obtained our rights, and so now you can promote a particular identity online which caters to the market and which for example, like there are like various papers Okay, I'll just make this short. I just wanted to know if it's almost like a ploy to say that it is no longer needed so that capitalist ends can be met and promoted. Is that something that, am I in the right direction when I think like this?
About it, but if you could elaborate it a more, like what is the role of women's studies courses in the post-national feminist era? Yes.
Hello. There are two there. I think we just take, or was it three? I can't remember. But raise your hands with some clarity.
Maybe I'm asking a wrong question, but if I understood you rightly, then you somewhere mentioned that there are elements of colonial and national esteem existing in the present day feminism.
Yes.
I would like to know that how do they impinge upon each other and sort of lead to this kind of a position wherein we say that we don't need feminism at all. Right?
Excellent.
A lot of vocabulary developed by feminism today has been adopted by a lot of, let me just say, right-wing forces as well. In terms of security, in terms of protection, the vocabulary developed by women's movement is being adopted. So how does feminist and women's movement today deal with that kind of adoption and negotiate with the state powers as well?
Yes, at the right to the back, and then maybe one here, and then that's it.
So, ma'am, I mean, we've interacted over Mahila Samakhya earlier and worked with Mahila Samakhya. My name is Taranga. I now work with TISS with special cells across various states. So, when you were talking about that now gender is part of what state is also talking and doing, I mean, I understand that, earlier it was fighting against, struggles around the Mathura rape case, and today it is that you have the PWDB Act and the struggle is how it gets implemented, or, special cells, Mahila Samakhya, how they expand rather than getting them into place. But what I'd like to know is, especially in the past few years, 5 years or so, we've been seeing that where more and more feminist praxis with the state is taking place in a direct sort of way, there are very sharp differences also coming out in rather public discourse and debate about what is the correct feminist position to fight for to be taken by the state from within the movement itself. Whether we look at the This India's Daughter ban or how PWDB gets implemented, or whether to work with the police at all or not, work within the police or not. So if you have time to dwell a little on those,
One last one.
Women's rights movement or feminism, whatever you call it, in the context of development and women's labor. Precisely what I'm trying to say is, as per Marxian views, access to private property is the one which promotes the inequality, right? But in the context of women's rights to land ownership or property rights, there is also a problem like when you fight for equal rights for land ownership or inheritance, in the context of underdevelopment, particularly when male out migration takes place, there is also a scenario arising that the whole burden of subsistence economy and taking care of entire household, everything is single-handedly gone to women. So, on the one hand, we see that access to property rights is a positive development for women, but its fallout is it is increasing the burden on women. So, what could you, suggest, which is better or kind of a thing?
All right, Lynn, I'm not sure that I have something called the right answer. Like, I don't think Professor Thapa would say she has the truth of history. But I think these are very much the kinds of questions that we need to be pressing and pushing today. And I noticed that some of your questions are precisely more closely concerned with the present moment. And my use of the term, I used it sort of somewhat provocatively, the term post and how we think about this word post. I am much clearer, none of you asked me that question, so maybe you agree with me or don't. I am much more clear in my own mind about the notion of the post-national. I think it's a very productive way of trying to recognize the extent to which what the ground that we inhabit now, the shifty ground that we inhabit now, is as much the product of changes beyond the nation as within the nation. That's the reason I use the word post, not because I love post-structuralism, but rather because I want to very accurately say that, because the usual story, I'm sure that this is talked about here as much as anywhere else, the usual story is we were colonial, we were nationalist, and now we're global. Right? Globalization has become the default reference point for anything that we talk about. Everything is in the era of globalization, right? So I find that, and I want to just repeat that here because perhaps in the, in presenting my paper it got a little sort of tightened. I do think that this present moment is as much constituted by changes happening within the nation as much as any other change that may be happening as a result of quote-unquote global processes. In other words, I want us to think of the women's, whether it be feminism or whether it be any other problematic, being co-constituted as much by global processes as by caste, the re-emergence of caste, the re-emergence of communalism. In a way, in the 60s and 70s, we had forgotten all about communalism. We had forgotten about Mahatma Gandhi's assassination and so on. These are questions that re-emerge now, and the questions of sexuality. All of these and more, I'm sure the list can continue. We must find a way, and I'm using the word post-national only to alert us to this combination. So it's in that light that I would like to say we live in an era, and I would put it this way, not so much in the post-feminist era, we live in an era after feminism. We live in an era when feminism has become visible, when feminism has become familiar, when feminism has been institutionalized in women's studies courses, and so on, and where the titles of books can now have feminism on their cover without a problem. You would have not found, I think Meera Desai, who's very much a figure from this part of India, was one of the only figures I know of that generation of women who identified as a feminist in the 1970s. And she put feminism even in her book. I don't know of too many others who did that. So I'm saying that we definitely live in a time after feminism. The term post-feminist has been used very specifically by theorists like Angela McRobbie, who would agree with what some of you have said. They see almost a conspiracy going on whereby the combination of capitalism, popular culture, and new trends in theory such as post-structuralism are all combining to make it necessary to take feminism into account. So it's no longer the era of outright attack. You can't be anti-feminist. See, this is the point. It's not a time in which you can be anti-feminist. So her understanding is that post-feminism is an ingenious, a clever way of shutting it down, taking away its politics, by nonetheless seemingly taking it into account. So you acknowledge that it's there, but you depoliticize it at the same time. And so many of the points that some of you have made, that it's a capitalist ploy, and so on, would be part of such an understanding. I feel that in our context in India, it's much more complex than that. I don't think that there is any simple way in which, I think there is a combination of factors that are at work. I would say that on the one hand, we might have, and I didn't say that in the paper, but I'm saying this here, we might be living in a time of some kind of backlash. In other words, when you have, for instance, things like men's groups emerging who are claiming that 498A must be sort of thrown away, that there is no room anymore for dowry, that it's only women who are harassing men for dowry, and there's not. These would be signs of a backlash. The students that I mentioned in the discussion in the paper are students who are struggling to think whether feminism can connect to their lives or not. And the upper class ones were saying, we don't really need feminism. And I hear this still a great deal. There are any number of metropolitan women who will today say, journalists, media people especially, who will say that they don't really think they need feminism, or they don't want to be slotted as people who then deal with women's issues or who identify with women's issues. I would call people like that post-feminists. That is to say, they recognize the women's question, but it's not for them. And the other group which I found equally interesting are women who are from lower class backgrounds, for whom it's alienation, for whom the idea of a feminist future, of being independent, of being able to be the source of your own, this idea of what feminism stands for, appears alienating because they do not see a future outside what maybe feminists would call patriarchal. That is to say, I have to find a good husband, I have to settle down, I need economic security, all of which seems to imply that they cannot be feminist. So I think this is the, if this helps, I think we need to find a way then, we need to find a way to engage with this complex of forces. In other words, there may be post-feminist elements in here, but I would not, capitalist culture is extraordinarily, and especially the media, is extraordinarily flexible. And the capitalist media will today maybe sound post-feminist, but if it suits them, they will sound extremely feminist. I mean, in a current moment today, the Times of India will be going on and on about how Delhi is the rape capital of India, and they've been saying so for the last 10 years, long before the Delhi December 16th case happened. So feminism can be good media copy. Feminism can be good for a certain kind of capitalism. Talking about women's choices can be good for capitalism. And I do not wish to completely say, oh, we know only too well that they're co-opting feminism and that they're a terribly bad thing. Let us be clear that it is in the era of capitalism too that feminism grew. Now, what forms it took, whether indeed it's communist or other alternative possibilities were blunted by this fact, but we cannot discount the fact. Certain versions of feminism grew in the era of colonialism. How do we make sense of that? You know, so I'm saying we will need to refine, in other words, we need to refine our sensibility about how we take our battles forward without too quickly looking for a pure space of our own that is somehow untouched by these big bad systems, whether it be colonialism, whether it be capitalism, and so on. I think we'll have to find ways of engaging from within. In other words, we have to find ways of engaging from within these guys, including occasionally, I think somebody asked me this question about co-option of vocabulary. That is to say, the right-wing forces may well co-opt our vocabulary. We need to recognize that fact. We need to name that that is happening, but that is not necessarily a reason for us to sort of say we can no longer use this vocabulary because now it has been, as it were. There is no, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, there is no pure space from within which we function. We function within a range of marked spaces, institutional spaces, which can include a women's studies space, for instance, which is itself also marked by the constraints of institutionalization. But nonetheless, having been marked by that space, let it make the maximum of its capacity to critique. I think the most powerful critiques are the critiques from within. In other words, what critiques can we make when we recognize the power that, say, patriarchy or gender places? If we believe that we're somehow outside of that, then my sense is that we will only more quickly fall into certain traps. In other words, be aware of where we are. Be aware of inhabiting a capitalist culture that finds certain elements of feminism extremely attractive. Okay, so that is my answer to the post-feminist or question. To the question of, when I mention these epistemes or these frameworks, the colonial, the national, and the post-national, I think we inhabit all of them. They all have a life. The colonial, in fact, continues to the extent to which something called Indian culture continues to have life today. If Indian women and Indian culture are constantly being paired with each other, and feminism is seen as in some conflict with Indian culture, then in my view, this is a creation of the colonial episteme and one that we must continue to fight. It could be the Pink Chuddy campaign, it could be slut walk. In all of these, it could be the Section 377. Why is it? Why is this constant phrase of woman or sexuality is against Indian culture? It seems to me that we need to first historicize that, see the roots of it, and then discover what are the ways in which, what are the kinds of tools, feminist tools that we can use to oppose it and to fight it, but recognizing that it still very much has a life. Also the national episteme of development continues to have a certain hold on us in our battles with globalization. The role of popular culture and popular icons, I would say, again, you have to be strategic. If a Beyonce or various figures today claim feminism, I would say it's a welcome gesture, but let's at the same time not simply think that just by virtue of having claimed feminism, this is an unmitigated victory for feminism. I would like to know more what her feminism is. What does it amount to? What kind of politics does she practice? In other, is it simply, to the extent that it only becomes some kind of a selling point, then it becomes a little less interesting. In other words, I would be interested in the politics of various groups, including the politics of groups and singers and others who disavow feminism or even oppose. So a Honey Singh, who is extremely homophobic and anti-feminist, is as important a figure for us to deal with as a Beyonce. I mean, there's no, to my mind, these are our celebrity figures whose politics should interest us in terms of where and how they pitch themselves. And we find obviously those who claim feminism more interesting than perhaps those who don't. But let us analyze even feminism doesn't place it beyond critique. You see, the fact that you claim feminism doesn't mean there's nothing more to say. It may be a mode of feminism that beyond a point hasn't got that much to offer us. And if so, then we want to know why. I think I'll stop there, and should we have a break at this point? Thank you very much. Intersectional perspective, and I promise it won't take as long as the previous one. I'm not going to cover as much ground as that one, but it's something I'm thinking with, and I would really very much welcome your thoughts and questions. And if there were any other questions, some of you came up at the end of the session. We had very good discussion here, but if there are other questions you want to raise, please do raise them. So I'm calling this the problem of women's labor, thinking with intersectionality. So the question is, what makes all the work that women do in a country like India elude worth and value? Why has more than a century of struggle yielded so little on this front? So I'm trying to look at a question that I think has been with us for a very, very long time, and one that I'm not sure even today we have a good grip on. So in other words, whether we call colonial, national, post, whatever term we may want to use, I am suggesting and I am thinking that it is a question for which we have yet to find the right way of actually naming the problem itself. So my point is not that we have answer to the question, but rather have we posed the question in the way that it probably needs to be posed. And in order to set up the problem as I see it, I'm going to a little bit sort of go back into recent history, that is to say, just from the 70s onwards, how has, and for those of you who are from development studies or women's studies, maybe this is all stuff you already know only too well. So let me outline the problem as I see it, beginning with the findings of those who have analyzed women's work within the Indian economy as a whole, and so provided an effective framework for contemporary and historical analysis. One of the early shocking discoveries that went into the Towards Equality report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India as far back as 1974 was the long-term decline in women's work participation revealed in the decennial census of India, a decline that could not be put down to colonial policies alone, but even continued after independence. A couple of decades later, in the wake of the famous feminization thesis by Guy Standing, which looked at global data from across the world to claim that the flexible workplace after structural adjustment now preferred women to men, most feminists examining Indian trends refuted such processes here. The only signs of feminization during the 1990s till at least 2005 seemed to be in agriculture, a sector where the largest proportion of women workers, mainly unpaid family cultivators and wage workers, were already to be found, and therefore hardly the site from which an argument about the positive effects of the new global economy could be made. Moreover, following 2005, statistical sources have pointed to disturbing declines in women's work participation rates, especially in manufacturing. So since the 1970s, the burden of many scholars and activists in India has been to show that our data sets are fundamentally misleading. Women are indeed engaged in productive economic work of all kinds, but our accounting systems are unable to capture and measure this. Efforts to improve the situation led to important changes, for instance, in census enumeration after 1991, as well as in expanding definitions of women's unpaid work in the national sample surveys. But this does not take away from the huge gap that is recorded between men and women in our workforces, especially in urban areas. After all is said and done, not to put too fine a point on it, we have one of the lowest female work participation rates in the world. When it comes to recent trends, some speak of an overall stagnation in women's work, others notice levels of volatility, oscillating nonetheless around a very low average. If we were to make a distinction between paid, women's paid and unpaid work, the figure, the overall figure that, and I'm curious to know how many of you are aware of this. What do you think, if you were to look at a percentage from women, all women, what percentage of women receive any kind of paid work? Any guesses as to what the figure might look like? All India, urban, rural, everything. What proportion of the population of women get any kind of paid work? I mean, what most of us would imagine our futures to be. We women, I mean, the women in this room would imagine having a future of paid work. Yes. Any thoughts?
Between 7 to 10, 20.
20. I want 20. Did somebody say 20? It's as low as 15. 1-5. Okay, 15% of the entire population, which means, by way of clarification, what this means is that only 15% of all women receive some kind of direct payment. In other words, whether you're self-employed, whether you're working in the home workers, whether you're in a salaried job, whether you're a daily wage worker, across this entire spectrum, only 15%, wherever you may be, service sector, factories and fields. No one beyond this figure receives a payment for the work that they do. And this is a figure, this figure 15% comes from 2007-8 of the National Sample Survey. In other words, we're talking about the period when India has witnessed the highest growth rates in its economy, and where a certain common sense would have us believe that we live in a time of unprecedented job opportunities, right? I mean, we've seen unprecedented growth rates in the last 20 years, so we would assume that it should translate into more job opportunities. But what the data in fact is saying is that the contemporary economic regime is one where 85% of all women, however long and hard many of them may be working at home, on farms, in various artisanal, in other productive contexts, are effectively living in relations of dependency, fundamentally attached to households, since they are engaging in some form or the other of unpaid family labor. These relations of dependency, while initially those of a daughter, are subsequently invariably structured by marriage. And from what we know about the lack of any effective implementation of property rights, this question had come up earlier, the lack of any effective implementation of property rights for those with land, assets, or other forms of capital, this means registering the enormity of such dependency and its wider ramifications for any discussion of women's work and chances for autonomy in India. This leads me to the first point I want to make in any analytical account of women's labor in our context, that is the centrality of the household and of the family within it. And the household and the family are not interchangeable terms, a point I will come to in a little while. It is a common place to list the range of work that is constitutive of the core of domestic labor: food preparation, cleaning, childcare, house maintenance. Notice that this list omits sexual services, a point I will come to in a little while. In a pioneering essay on the materiality and ideologies of domestic life, Kumkum Sangari has drawn on the thesis of a French feminist that unpaid household labor is given the framework of lasting personal arrangements and relationships which are not and cannot be measured in terms of time and money. Hence, that patriarchies build personal relationships into exploitation, operate inside the spheres of relationships of love, nurture, and sexuality are indeed inseparable from them. Sangari goes on to speculate whether this is the source of ideologies of selfless devotion in contexts like ours, which render this domain as non-alienated labor by daughters, wives, mothers, and daughters-in-law. Prominent analyses in India when trying to conceptualize women's work have drawn from both feminist and Marxist traditions of understanding labor, where labor represents value, and women's low status was seen to be a consequence of their lack of acknowledged economic participation. Considerable effort and much debate has gone into contesting conceptions of productive and non-productive labor. Given the low levels of women's presence in the workforce overall, and the even lower proportions of those women who are paid for their labor, broadly two kinds of arguments have been forthcoming. The first, which I've already touched upon, involved making women's labor more visible, giving it value by attempts to measure it, especially domestic and family labor. The second consisted in demanding an increasing share for women in labor markets that were turning out to be increasingly masculinist. Contrasts have been drawn between North and South India, for instance, arguing that the lower work participation rates in the North made for more gender inequality, especially towards daughters. However, this is where we already come up against a problem. A feminist analysis, even of a Marxist feminist kind, that only looks at the gender division of labor within the domestic sphere and women's chances for paid work in the labor market beyond, is flawed. Even when differences of caste and class are acknowledged, these become secondary to the main effort of highlighting the working of patriarchal biases. Over and over again, in a range of studies, the main focus is to question the perception of women as non-workers, at best supplementary or contingent, whether they be poor or educationally highly qualified. Borrowing the term of intersectionality may be helpful here. The explicit use of the term, as some of you may know, comes from the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, but the idea it draws from goes way back to the first black feminist organizations of the 1970s, such as the Combahee River Collective. Their statement described the simultaneity of oppressions experienced by black women in American capitalism and the need for what they call, and they were one of the first people to use this term that we now use with mixed feelings, identity politics. The Combahee group in 1974 was the first group to use the term identity politics. And they use, and I really want us to pay close attention here, the term was used precisely because of the ways in which those at the bottom or at the intersections of gender, class, race, and sexuality were getting lost. In other words, the term identity politics was used not because people are becoming visible, but because people are becoming lost at the intersection. The intersections is the place, the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, or in our case, caste, class, and so on, are not places where the simultaneity of oppressions becomes more clear to us. It rather becomes more obscure. It rather becomes the place where the actual person disappears. So identity politics was born through the fate of disappearance. Okay? Black Women Studies reader, which is all the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. This was the title of a Black Women Studies reader. So this actually gets more at the problem. In other words, the problem is that they are not there. Not that they are there, but that they are not there. In other words, if we go back to the conceptual underpinnings of identity politics, its purpose was never to prioritize a particular identity such as black women against other structures such as capitalism, but rather to recognize what constitutive mechanisms such as race were disappearing at the intersections. In the context of the discussions I'm having with you here, it is the determinations of caste, class, and sexuality sustaining the domestic sphere which are in danger of getting lost. In other words, if we have a simple sexual division of labor type of argument, women in the home and men in the workplace, we are missing most of the story. This is not to diminish the gender dimensions of domestic relations, given the ongoing naturalization of the sexual division of labor, but only to say that feminists need to do much more than to render this dimension more visible. To put it differently, those at the margins or bottom of hierarchies of caste and sexuality inhabit extremely fragile domestic spaces and are invariably rendered invisible in the reproduction of the domestic spheres of those in positions of relative privilege. Now my next section, labor as stigma. Bringing in questions of caste raises some fundamental questions for a Marxist feminist approach to theorizing women's labor. To put it at its sharpest, a labor theory of value stands in conflict with a caste-structured society wherein public labor represents stigma and humiliation. In other words, in order to sort of think about what, say, people like B.R. Ambedkar and Dalit theorists have been talking about in connecting class to caste, we need to find a way to think about the experience of labor not just as exploitation. That is what Marxism has given us. Labor as exploitation. But we need to also think about labor as degradation. That is to say, which has profound implications since stigma cannot be valorized like value-producing labor. This is because stigma cannot be abstracted from the body. I would also want to add that this is because the body is always sexed. If there is a distinctive quality to the degradations of, say, male Dalit labor, this quality attains a new register when the labouring body is that of a Dalit woman. In the course of a wide-ranging review of the relations across caste, gender, sexuality and labour, dwelling on the social status of the work that lower caste and Dalit women undertake, Neena Gopal has pointed out how it is precisely the nature of the work that she has to perform that signifies her as low, inferior and stigmatized. While her labour in other households for the women of those households marks her clearly as inferior but provides a modicum